start with a new chapter, chapter number 9. It's about foundation of a group behavior. Starting this chapter, we are going to start with a new phase of studying organization behavior. In this phase, we are going to talk about group dynamics. We are going to discuss chapter number 9 and then chapter number 10, which is about teams. But first, we need to talk about groups in general. So in chapter number 9, we are going to discuss foundation of a group behavior. Of course, the learning objectives here, as usual, we need to discuss definitions, concepts related to groups in general. Also, we need to know how groups are formed. And in this regard, we are going to discuss two different models about groups formation, in addition to other issues related to groups, like, for example, norms. We need to identify what are the advantages, disadvantages, benefits, how can we use groups, what's the importance of groups in work context in general. Also, we are going to discuss how groups take decisions. This is also one of the important issues that we need to discuss. Earlier, we discussed how individuals take decisions. In this chapter also, we are going to discuss how groups usually take decisions. So there are different topics which we are going to discuss in this regard. Now, first, let us start with the main concept here, which is groups. What is a group? If we need to define group, how can we define a group? When you talk about a group, we are talking usually or always we are talking about more than one individual. We are talking about two or more individuals. But why individuals form a group? And this is part of the definition. Why individuals form a group? Okay, but what you are discussing is why individuals join groups. What you are discussing is why individuals join groups. But here we need first to define a group. In a group, we are talking about two or more individuals. In the status here, we are talking about achieving goals or objectives. That's why groups usually are formed, to achieve goals and objectives. But those individuals who work together in order to achieve goals and objectives, there are two important points that we need to discuss here. First, that they need to interact and interdependently. Here we are talking about interaction between those individuals. They need to cooperate, they need to communicate, they need to help each other. At the same time, here we are talking about interdependent status. We are talking about individuals who are depending on each other, who are helping each other. In other words, an individual cannot achieve what group can achieve in certain situations. That's why in certain situations, individuals, instead of working alone, they prefer to work with groups. Why? Because they have better chance here to achieve the goals. Of course, not all assignments we need groups or teams, but there are certain tasks or assignments or circumstances where the final output cannot be achieved without a group. In such cases, we need a group to accomplish the work. So when you talk about a group, here we are talking again about two or more individuals interacting and interdependent who have come together to achieve particular objectives. So if there is no objective, there is no need to form a group. So this is one of the preconditions which is needed in order to form any group. There should be some objective which is to be achieved by all those individuals who are forming a group. Now, when you talk about groups, we are talking about different types of groups. Okay, mainly there are two main types of groups: formal groups and informal groups. Now, here we are talking about organization and context in both cases, but within organization, within any organization, there are formal groups and there are informal groups. What are the differences between formal and informal groups? Yes?
Well, formal groups describe the structural kind of group that is organized by the organization or the firm itself in order to achieve one or two objectives. But when it comes to the informal groups, it is like between the group member or the employees, but without the structure imposed on them.
Okay, so there are groups which is created by the organization, and usually or always it is identified by the organization structure. And there are other groups which is some sort of relation between employees who are working within the organization. So in both cases we are talking about organization and context, but there are formal groups which is part of the organization structure. It is identified or described by the organizational structure of the firm or organization, and of course they are together in order to accomplish objectives, assignments, tasks, whatever. At the same time, there are informal groups. Here we are talking about individuals within the organization who have some sort of relation, and according to that they are identified as a group. Okay. Of course, what are the types of formal and informal? We are going to discuss this later. But here again, there is the main difference here, that when we talk about formal groups, we are talking about the organization structure itself and how there are divisions within the organization, departments, sections, and so on. When we talk about informal groups, we are talking about alliances or friendship relations or any type of relation which is not organized by the organization itself. Okay, now when you talk about those two main types, formal and informal, there are subtypes. Okay, so when you talk about formal groups, we are talking here about command groups and task groups. Those are some of the types of formal groups. Now, when you talk about a command group, a few moments ago, when I have discussed the formal group, I said that it is identified within the organization structure. Usually there is some sort of divisions which is identified by the organization itself. Those divisions, when we talk about main departments, sections, divisions, whatever, here we are talking about command groups. Okay, so when we talk about the command groups, usually we are talking about more permanent groups. Those groups are relatively permanent. Of course, we are not talking about totally permanent. We are talking about relatively permanent groups. Okay, so those groups usually they follow some functions. Okay, they are not assigned tasks or assignments which is going to end in a short time. No, we are talking here more about function. Like for example, marketing department. Here we are talking about a command group. Okay, if we are talking about the human resource department or any division or section within the organization, here we are talking about a command group where there is a group of individuals and there is a supervisor or manager, and usually this supervisor and manager is managing the group to accomplish or to fulfill certain functions which is needed by the organization. Now, when you talk about task groups, here we are talking about individuals who come together in order to accomplish a certain assignment. And usually here we are talking about shorter term, comparing those groups to command groups. Like committees, for example, temporary teams, which is needed in order to accomplish certain assignments or tasks and so on. So those both are formal groups. Okay, those groups are identified by the organization. It is placed in the organizational structure. It is determined by the management and so on. Now, on the other hand, there are the informal groups. Here again, there are subtypes of informal groups. One of those is interest groups, and the second one is friendship groups. Now, usually, between any group, whether it is formal or informal, there is an objective. And this we said that it is a precondition to form any group, that there should be some sort of joint objective where all the members of a group believe in. So when you talk about command groups, there is the function that must be followed or accomplished. Now when you talk about task groups, there is the assignment. Okay. Now when you talk about interest groups and friendship groups, here we are talking about individuals who are having personal relation, social relation. We are not talking about organizational relation, though they are working in the same organization. Now, when you talk about interest groups, those groups, they join a certain objective, which is related usually to work, okay, but they are not a formal group, they are informal group. Yani, for example, they have a common interest. But when we talk about friendship group, usually they have common characteristics. People become friends because they have common characteristics or personal traits and so on. And sometimes because they have interests. But when they have interest, we call this an interest group. Okay? A friendship group, usually they are more tight. Why? Because they have common characteristics, which also mean that friendship groups, if we are talking about permanent, temporary, they are relatively permanent. Comparing those groups to interest groups, because interest groups, somehow, it is like task groups. When the task is finished, the task group is not needed. And when the interest is fulfilled, the interest group is not needed here. But when you talk about friendship groups, we are talking about some people who are joining some personal characteristics or traits, and that's why those groups are, or they have more tight relationship, and that's why we can say that they are relatively, they last for more time, comparing those two interest groups. Okay. Now, we said, let us go back a few steps here. We said that there are formal groups and informal groups. And we are talking about organization behavior, and we are describing things within organizational context. What is the importance of studying informal groups when we talk about organization behavior in general? Why we are talking about informal groups? We are talking about organizations. Why we do not talk only about formal groups and neglect informal groups? Why informal groups are also important? Yes?
Because after all, employees are human beings, and these human beings always tend to socialize with each other. And when we're studying the organizational context, we cannot just ignore the social side of this, because of course the social relationships and the informal relationship will affect the atmosphere, for example, of the group.
Okay.
So it is important to study both of them, because we cannot just treat them as machines or workers.
Okay. What else? Why it is important to study informal groups?
Okay, I think the informal groups is like, as she said, socializing and interacting with other people. So of course this will affect their perception, the employees' perceptions, attitudes, enthusiasm toward the work, and ultimately their performance.
Okay, but informal groups, they are going to affect more things, like what? Beyond the individuals. I'm not talking about how groups are only going to interact and affect each other. I mean the individuals here, beyond this. When you talk about informal groups, okay, we are talking about an important determinant of organization performance. And that's why we cannot neglect informal groups when we study organizational behavior, or when we talk about management in general. Okay. Now, when you talk about communications, for example, sometimes informal groups can facilitate communications between individuals within the organization. I'm talking about formal communications. And sometimes informal groups are going to hinder communication or cooperation, for example, or leadership efforts to accomplish certain assignments and so on. So when you talk about informal groups, we are not talking about something which is outside the organization. No, we are talking about something which is inside the organization. And those groups are going to affect the organization performance in general. Okay. And it does not matter how much the organization have money, for example, equipment, good plans, etc., systems. All those are important requirements. Okay, but if the informal groups, for example, okay, decide to fight the organization, they are going to destroy the organization. I'm talking about radical example, but it will help us to understand why informal groups are important. Now, when you talk about organization behavior in general, some advanced studies are there which is related, they call it sociometry. In sociometry, they study the informal relations between individuals within the organization. Why? Because this should help the organization, for example, in forming formal groups. Why? Because people who have good relations with each other, they can understand each other better, they can communicate easily, they are going to help each other, for example, and so on. Whenever they want to restructure the organization, it is important that we need to understand the type of relations available in the organization. When we need to, for example, to form a committee or a team, a task team to accomplish a certain assignment, it is important to understand who can communicate better with each other, who have good relation with each other, and so on. So we cannot neglect or ignore informal groups because it is one of the most important determinants of organization performance. Okay, and it is going to either facilitate formal groups efforts or sometimes it is going to hinder formal groups effort. That's why we need to study informal groups parallelly. When we talk about formal, informal, we need to understand the formal relations within the organization and the informal relations within the organization, because this is going to affect the organization performance in general. Now, why people join groups, this may be what you have discussed earlier. There are different reasons why people decide to join groups. One of those is security. Of course, if we discuss it simply, two or more individuals, they are more able to face different situations, problems, better than one individual. So instead of standing alone to face a certain problem, we can help each other to face the problem. Of course, there are other reasons, like, for example, status. Each group, by its members, its role, etc., is going to earn some sort of respect, status, and this is due to its members also. Of course, self-esteem. Here we are talking about individuals feeling that they can accomplish, they are members of an important group, for example, what the type of tasks or assignments that they deal with because they are members of a certain group. In addition to affiliation, we are talking about social relations here, of course, power, because we can, our influence is much better when we are member of groups, because the group should help, of course, its members to accomplish different assignments or attain different goals and so on. And of course, goal achievement, which is we considered earlier as one of the preconditions of forming any group. And it is, if there is no common goal between individuals who are members of any group, usually there is no reason to join the group. And if the group is formed, usually the relations within the group is weak and there is no direction that they are following here, and that's why usually such groups without goals and objectives, usually it is useless, it is ineffective, because here there is nothing to accomplish. That's why I said earlier that it is one of the preconditions, that when you talk about a group, there should be a common objective which is shared by all the members of a certain group. Okay. Now, when you talk about how groups are formed, there are different models here. Today, at least, let us discuss one of those models. This model is known as the 5-stage model, or the developmental model. It is another title for this model. In the 5-stage model, there are 5 main stages, which is recognized as the stages which any group is going to go through while forming the group. According to the 5-stage model, the first stage is known as forming. Now, when you talk about forming, usually here members are facing a lot of uncertainty and so on, and this is the phase that the group is in. So while forming, here we are talking about feeling uncertainty and so on. Now, the second stage is storming. Now, when you talk about storming, here we are talking about a lot of conflicts between members of the group. Okay, so usually there is some sort of uncertainty. After that, there are conflicts between those members. Now, the third stage is norming. Okay, now when you talk about norming, usually here the relationship between the group is more cohesive. The group here, they have a better relationship, and this should help them to go to the 4th stage, which is performing. Now, when you talk about performing, the group is fully functional here. Here they are able to interact with the assignment or task, and they start to achieve things. And the 5th stage is adjourning. Here we are talking about dissolving the group, especially when we talk about temporary groups. Now, let us go back to those stages and discuss why at the first stage there is feelings of uncertainty. Why in the forming stage there is feelings of uncertainty? Yes?
Maybe, at the first, the members of the group don't know each other in a good way. They don't know if they can accomplish this group or accomplish these goals which they want to achieve or not. So they are maybe afraid, uncertainty.
Okay, so maybe one of the reasons that they need to get acquainted to each other, they do not know each other. What else? Yes?
Because the group members are uncertain, they are uncertain of the purpose of the group,
Okay.
the structure of the group, the leadership among the members.
Okay. And
all this stuff.
and the most important is the first point, though all the points you have mentioned are equally important, but relatively, when you talk about the purpose itself, usually the group at this stage, they are uncertain about the purpose, the objective, the final output that they need to reach, and this is one of the most important reasons why there are a lot of, why there is some uncertainty. In addition to other points, like when you talk how we are going to reach this purpose or fulfill this purpose, the leadership rule, what are the rules of each individual team member or group members here, and so on. Okay. Now, in the second stage, when you talk about storming, there are more conflicts here. Why there are conflicts? Why at this stage there are more conflicts?
Because the conflicts arise because of the control thing. Who is on control? Who will be on the top of the hierarchy? So formulating the hierarchy of the group and who is the leader or who is in control creates conflicts between them.
Okay. And if we go back to those points which caused uncertainty, those points need to be resolved. Okay, so here we need to reach solutions, or we need to agree about those points. What is our purpose? So there is going to be different points of view. There are going to be some sort of discussions. Sometimes those discussions and different point of views are going to cause some sort of conflict. When you talk about conflict, we are talking about two parties who need to agree about something, or there is some sort of disagreement between them. So there is disagreements which is related to purposes, for example, allocating the roles, for example, of individuals, how to deal with the resources, what to do in order to accomplish the goal, objective, and so on. So all those disagreements need to be resolved, and that's why there are some sort of conflicts between the members, and all those conflicts must be resolved. Okay. Now, in the third stage, here we are talking about norming. At this stage, usually the group is able to establish some sort of basic grounds where they agree on things, and this is a result. It is a result of the second stage. Okay, so here the group develop more basic grounds where they can start their work. The relationship between the groups is more normal, we can say here. Why? Because at the early two stages there was a lot of discussions, meetings, for example, and so on. And usually within that time, the group members they understand each other much better. They can communicate more effectively, and they are able to deal with different problems and find solutions to those problems. Now, if the group reach, according to the 5-stage model, if the group reach to this stage or level, they can start working. They can, we can describe them as functional groups because they accomplish work. They start here to achieve goals and objectives. Now, according to the model, only in temporary groups, we are talking here about the 5th stage. So if we are talking about permanent group, we are talking about 4-stage model. If we are talking about temporary groups, we are talking here about the total package, which is the 5 stages. Now, in the 5th stage here, and as it is mentioned in temporary groups, here we are talking about how to wrap up activities. Why? Because in temporary groups we need to finish the work and go to another assignment or go back to our command groups, for example. Okay. Now here usually there is a 5th stage, which is a during stage. Okay. But if we are talking about command groups, for example, which is relatively permanent, so we are going to stop here at the 4th stage. Okay. Now, though this is, it seems to be logical, but there are a lot of criticisms here when we talk about the 5-stage model. It might be clear that there is some sort of oversimplification of the process itself. When we talk about group forming, we are not talking about simply as we have described the situation. The issue is much more complex here. Why? It is much more complex. Yes?
Because a lot of parties and a lot of personas are involved in the process.
We are talking about human behavior after all, and we can never simplify human behavior. There is always some sort of complexity, and this must be taken into consideration. Okay, so it is not like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, then the group is formed. There are a lot of details here which is related to how individuals are going to interact with each stage. That's why we consider that the process described is maybe simplifying how things are really happen. Now, the second here reason for this criticism, when you talk about conflicts, usually we talk about 2 types of conflicts. We have what we call positive conflicts, and we have what we call negative conflicts. Okay. Now, when you talk about positive conflicts, we expect positive results. That's why we call it positive conflict. Okay. Now, when you talk about negative conflicts, here we expect negative results, and that's why we call it negative conflicts. Now, this means that the group might go through a positive conflict, and it might go through a negative conflict. So not always conflicts are going to be harmful to those groups. Sometimes those conflicts are going to be conducive to high performance, or it's going to help the group to perform better. So this depends on the conflict itself, the nature of the conflict, whether it is a positive conflict or negative conflict. Now, a third reason here, okay, the process, it is not always gradual or linear. It's not always that it is like when we have discussed Maslow pyramid. We said that it is not that we are going to fulfill the needs of the first level and then go to the second level. And the same here. Okay, those are two different topics, but the same idea here. It's not like we are going to fully finish stage 1 and then we are going to start with totally new stage, starting with stage 2, and the same when you talk about the next stage and so on. Sometimes those stages are going to overlap. Okay, so it is not always a linear process or a gradual process. Sometimes the process is going to be mixed up here when we talk about different stages. Also, that's why we say that sometimes those stages might mixed up together, or it is going to simultaneously occur. Okay, now also groups may regress. Sometimes we might reach to a certain level and we find out that there are new important information, for example, and we need to rethink the situation. Or we are going to find that we fail accomplishing the initial stages and we need to re-deal with the initial stages, or whatever reason are there. But for different reasons, the groups might regress, they might go back to initial stages because there is something new or something wrong or whatever. Okay. Also, it ignores the organizational context. Here, if you have noticed, when we have discussed the stages, we were talking about the groups only. And what is happening within the group, we did not discuss how organizations are going to influence what is happening within the groups. And those groups, we are talking about organization behavior, we are talking about groups within organizations. So organizational context here is very important when we discuss the group formation process. Why? Because we are not talking about separated group. We are talking here about something which is integrated with the organization. It is part, or it is one of the components of the organization. Okay, any questions? يعطيكم العافية.